The Mafia boss received an unmarked envelope, inside a photo of him and the smiling mayor. That single image had the power to destroy everything Marcus DeVito had built over 20 years in Chicago. The autumn wind howled through the streets of the Gold Coast neighborhood as Marcus stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, holding the photograph between his fingers. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a man of 52 years, silver threading through his dark. Hair, eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too much and forgiven too little. The photograph showed him shaking hands with Mayor Richard Holloway at a charity gala 3 years ago. Both men were smiling, their expressions relaxed, comfortable. But it was what the photograph implied that made Marcus's blood run cold. Someone knew, someone had been watching, and now someone wanted him to know that they held his fate in their hands. Marcus turned the envelope over again, searching for any clue about its origin. Nothing. Just plain white paper, no return address, delivered by a courier service that had already confirmed the sender paid in cash and gave no name. The photograph itself was professional quality, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Whoever did this had resources, patience, and most importantly, a purpose they had not yet revealed. His phone buzzed on the marble counter, a message from his younger brother, Anthony. "Family dinner tonight. Mom is asking. About you." Marcus stared at the words for a long moment before sliding the phone into his pocket without responding. Family dinner felt like a concept from another lifetime, one where he had not spent 2 decades building an empire that existed in the shadows between legitimacy and something far more dangerous. The DeVito family had arrived in Chicago 4 generations ago, poor immigrants from Sicily with nothing but determination and a willingness to do whatever survival required. His great-grandfather had started with a small grocery store. His grandfather had expanded into construction. His father had taken that construction company and transformed it into something else entirely, a network of businesses that served as fronts for activities the police could never quite prove, but always suspected. And Marcus had inherited all of it: the legitimate businesses, the restaurants, the real estate holdings, the import company, and the other things, the loans that banks would not approve, the protection that small business owners paid for willingly because the alternative was worse, the connections that made problems disappear and opportunities appear. He had tried, in his own way, to move the family toward legitimacy. He had closed down the most violent operations, focused on the businesses that merely bent the law rather than shattered it. But the past was not something that could be outrun, only managed. Now someone was threatening to expose the one connection he had worked hardest to protect: his relationship with the mayor. Richard Holloway had been a city councilman when they first met, an ambitious young politician with expensive tastes and not enough money to fund them. Marcus had seen an opportunity. Campaign contributions funneled through legitimate businesses, introductions to wealthy donors who owed Marcus favors, and in return, zoning approvals that always seemed to go the DeVito company's way, building permits that sailed through bureaucracy, city contracts that landed in his lap with suspicious regularity. It was corruption, pure and simple. But it was also how the city worked, how it had always worked. Marcus had simply learned to play the game better than most. The photograph proved nothing on its own: 2 men shaking hands at a public event. But if whoever sent it had more, if they had records of payments, recordings of conversations, evidence of the deals that had been made in private rooms and quiet restaurants, then everything would collapse: his businesses, his freedom, and quite possibly his life. Marcus walked to his study, a room lined with books he had actually read, and sat behind the desk that had once belonged to his father. He opened the bottom drawer and removed a burner phone, one of several he kept for communications that could never be traced. He dialed a number from memory. The voice that answered was gravelly, cautious. "Yeah." "Someone sent me a message," Marcus said. "A photograph. Me and Holloway at the Foundation Gala 3 years back." Silence on the other end. Then, "What do they want?" "That is what I need to find out. I want you to trace the courier service. Find out everything you can about who sent this. And Tony, Be quiet about it. I do not want anyone knowing about this until I understand what we are dealing with. He ended the call and placed the phone back in the drawer. Then he sat in the darkness of his study, watching the lights of Chicago sparkle through the window, and wondered who had decided to declare war on him. The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. Marcus arrived at his office in the Loop, a corner suite in a building his company owned, and tried to focus on the legitimate work that demanded his attention. Contracts to review, meetings with architects about a new development on the South Side, a conference call with investors from New York who wanted to expand their partnership. But his mind kept returning to the photograph. He had enemies. A man in his position could not avoid them. Rivals who resented his success, former associates who felt they had been treated unfairly, law enforcement officers who had spent careers trying to build cases against him, only to watch them fall apart for lack of evidence. Any of them might have sent the envelope, but why now, and what did they hope to gain? His assistant, a sharp young woman named Eleanor, who had worked for him for 5 years and knew better than to ask questions, knocked on his door. "Mr. DeVito? Your 11 o'clock is here." She paused, studying his face with concern she was careful to hide. "Should I tell them you need to reschedule?" "No." Marcus straightened his tie and forced his expression into something resembling calm. "Send them in." The meeting was with a community organization from Pilsen, representatives of a neighborhood that had seen too much disinvestment and too little hope. They wanted his company to fund a youth center, a place where kids could go, after school instead of wandering streets that offered too many dangerous alternatives. Marcus listened to their presentation, asked thoughtful questions, and ultimately agreed to contribute $500,000 to the project. It was not entirely altruistic. The donation would generate positive publicity, strengthen his reputation as a businessman who gave back to the community, and create goodwill with local politicians who represented districts he hoped to develop. But it was not entirely calculated either. Marcus remembered being a young man in a neighborhood not so different from Pilsen, remembered the lack of options and the pressure to take paths that led nowhere good. If he could give some kids a different choice, that meant something, even if his own choices had been more complicated. After the meeting, he stood by his window again, looking down at the streets 30 floors below. People moved through their lives, unaware of the forces that shaped their world. The deals, made in rooms like this one, the money that flowed through channels they would never see, the power that determined which neighborhoods thrived and which ones withered. Marcus had spent his entire adult life understanding those forces, learning to direct them, becoming one of them, and now someone was threatening to expose everything. His phone buzzed. Tony, the gravelly voice from the burner phone, now calling on his regular line. "Mr. DeVito, I have some information about that delivery you asked me to look into. Can we meet?" Marcus named a restaurant in Little Italy, a place his family had frequented for decades, where the owner knew to give them a private room and forget they had ever been there. 1 hour. The restaurant smelled of garlic and tomato sauce, scents that transported Marcus back to Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house, before he understood what his family really did, before the weight of inheritance settled on his shoulders. Tony was already waiting in the back room, a stocky man in his 60s with a face that had seen violence and a mind that had learned to anticipate it. "The courier service is a dead end," Tony said without preamble. "Whoever sent that envelope knew what they were doing, paid cash, no cameras caught their face, gave a fake name. But I did find something interesting." He slid a folder across the table. "There have been other envelopes, same style, same courier service, sent to 3 other people in the past month." Marcus opened the folder and studied the names inside. A federal judge known for his lenient sentencing of white-collar criminals, a union leader who controlled the construction workers in the city, and a police captain who had been notably unhelpful in investigations involving certain prominent families. All of them people who, like Marcus, operated in the gray zones of power. All of them people with secrets worth protecting. "Someone is building a collection," Marcus said slowly. "But for what purpose? That is what I have not figured out yet." Tony leaned back in his chair. "None of them have received any demands. No requests for money, no threats, no communication at all beyond the photographs. It is like someone wants them to know they are being watched, but has not decided what to do about it yet, or they are waiting for the right moment. Marcus closed the folder. Find out if these people have any enemies in common, and see if you can identify anyone who might have access to all of them. Photographer, security company, someone who moves in these circles without being noticed. After Tony left, Marcus sat alone in the private room, picking at a plate of pasta he had no appetite for. The situation was more complex than he had initially feared. This was not a single enemy targeting him specifically. This was something larger, more organized, more patient. Someone was assembling leverage against multiple powerful figures in Chicago, building a portfolio of compromising connections that could be deployed at any time. The question was whether to wait and see what happened, or to take action before the threat materialized. Marcus had survived in this world by being proactive rather than reactive, by identifying dangers before they became crises, and eliminating them before they could cause harm. But he could not eliminate a threat he could not identify, and moving too aggressively might provoke exactly the exposure he was trying to avoid. He thought about calling Mayor Holloway, warning him about the photograph, but that would mean admitting the vulnerability, acknowledging that their arrangement had been documented. Holloway was not a man who handled pressure well. He might panic, make mistakes, draw attention to connections that were better left in shadow. No, Marcus would handle this himself, at least until he understood what he was dealing with. His phone buzzed again, a text message from his daughter, Sophia, whom he had not seen in 3 months. She lived in New York now, worked at a non-profit that helped refugees navigate the immigration system. She had left Chicago at 18, attended college on the East Coast, and built a life as far from her family's business as possible. But she still called on his birthday, still sent pictures of her apartment and her friends, still maintained a connection that Marcus treasured more than any of his wealth or power. The message was simple: coming to Chicago next week. Can we have dinner? Just you and me. Marcus stared at the words, feeling something loosen in his chest. Of course, he replied. Name the restaurant. I will be there. Whatever storm was coming, whatever threat the photograph represented, he would face it. He had faced worse and survived, but he would not let it touch his daughter. He would not let the sins of his past contaminate the only purely good thing he had managed to create. He did not know yet how difficult that promise would be to keep. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy stories of power, secrets, and the complicated lives of people who walk the line between light and darkness, this is the place for you. Subscribe now, so you do not miss what happens next in this story. The week passed slowly, each day bringing new fragments of information that added up to an incomplete picture. Tony identified 2 more recipients of mysterious photographs: a hospital administrator with connections to insurance fraud and a real estate developer whose projects had a suspicious habit of receiving favorable environmental assessments. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone was documenting the web of corruption that held Chicago together, the informal arrangements and quiet compromises that made the city function. But the purpose remained unclear. Blackmail seemed obvious, but no demands had been made. Law enforcement seemed unlikely. Federal agents would not announce their surveillance so openly. A journalist building an investigation might explain the research, but would not typically alert their targets. And a rival criminal organization would be more direct, would already be making demands or making moves to take advantage of the leverage they had accumulated. Marcus continued his normal routines, attending to business, making appearances at the charity events and business functions that maintained his reputation as a legitimate businessman. But beneath the surface, he was mapping connections, identifying potential suspects, preparing for contingencies. He had his accountants review every transaction that might link him to the mayor. He had his lawyers examine the legal exposure, the statutes of limitations, the potential charges that could be filed if the relationship became public. The news was not encouraging. Campaign finance violations, conspiracy, bribery. The list of potential charges was long and serious. Even if he escaped prosecution, the exposure would destroy his relationship with Holloway, eliminate his political influence, and invite scrutiny that would threaten every aspect of his operations. His legitimate businesses would suffer from the association with scandal. His other operations would become impossible to maintain, as law enforcement used the publicity as justification for increased surveillance. On Thursday, Sophia arrived in Chicago. They met at a quiet Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, far from the neighborhoods where his name carried weight and his presence would be noticed. She looked beautiful, his daughter, her mother's dark eyes, his own stubborn jaw, a confidence in her bearing that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with her own achievements. "You look tired," she said after they had ordered, studying him with the same directness that had characterized her since childhood. "Is everything okay?" Marcus smiled, deflecting the concern with practiced ease. "Business is busy. The new development on the south side is taking more of my time than I expected, but I am managing." Sophia nodded, but her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. She had always been perceptive, had always seen through the carefully constructed explanations he offered for the irregularities in their family life. As a teenager, she had stopped asking questions, had simply decided she did not want to know. But the distance between them, the careful boundaries she had established around their relationship, told him that she knew enough. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, swirling wine in her glass, "about family, about where we come from and how much that determines where we go. What brought this on?" She hesitated. "One of my clients, a woman from Syria, lost her husband in the war, came here with 3 children and nothing else. She has been fighting for asylum for 2 years, and we finally got her case approved last month. She told me that she used to believe that her children would be defined by the trauma they experienced, by the violence they witnessed. But now she believes they can choose differently, that the past does not have to be a prison." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. "And you are wondering if that applies to our family too. I am wondering if it applies to you, Dad." Sophia met his eyes, and he saw something there he had not seen before. Not accusation, but something gentler and more painful. Hope, perhaps, or the fading remnants of it. "I know you have tried to move the business in a different direction. I know you closed down some of the operations that Grandpa ran, but are you ever going to be truly free of it? Is that even possible?" He wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything was changing, that the past was finally being left behind. But he thought of the photograph in his desk drawer, the web of compromising relationships he had spent decades building, and knew that such promises would be lies. "I do not know," he admitted. "Some choices create consequences that last longer than we expect. But I am trying, and whatever happens, I want you to know that your choices are your own. You built your life separate from all of this, and I am prouder of that than I can express." Sophia reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know you are not a bad person, Dad. I have always known that. I just wish circumstances had given you more options." They finished dinner, talking about her work, her friends, a man she had been seeing who taught philosophy at Columbia. Normal conversation, the kind of relationship he had always wanted with his daughter but had rarely been able to sustain. When they parted on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, she hugged him tightly, and he breathed in the scent of her perfume and allowed himself one moment of pure, uncomplicated love. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Tony. "We need to talk. Tonight." The meeting took place in a warehouse on the west side, a property Marcus owned through a series of shell companies. Tony was waiting with another man, someone Marcus did not recognize, thin, nervous, wearing clothes that suggested money, but a demeanor that suggested fear. "This is Daniel Reese," Tony said. "He is an investigator, works for corporate clients usually, but 6 months ago he was hired for a special project." Marcus studied the nervous man. Hired by whom? Reese swallowed visibly. "I do not know his real name. He contacted me through an intermediary, paid extremely well, cash, delivered, to a drop location. My job was to document relationships, photograph meetings, trace financial connections, build profiles of influential people in the city. He gave me a list of targets and a timeline, and I was on that list." "You were at the top of it," Reese's voice trembled slightly. "But I did not know who I was really working for. I thought it was a law firm, maybe someone preparing for litigation. That is the kind of work I usually do." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. "What changed? Why are you talking to me now? Because I figured out who my client really is." Reese pulled a folder from his bag and handed it over. "There is a woman named Victoria Chase. She runs a consulting firm downtown, specializes in political strategy. On the surface, she is legitimate, works with campaigns, helps clients navigate government relations. But underneath, she is something else. She is the one who hired me, and she is using the information I gathered to build leverage against everyone who holds power in this city." Marcus opened the folder and studied the documents inside. Photographs of a woman in her 40s, attractive in a severe way, with sharp features and intelligent eyes. Corporate filings for her consulting firm. Client lists that included political campaigns, government agencies, and private companies. And something else. Connections to a private equity firm based in New York, one that had been quietly acquiring distressed properties throughout Chicago for the past 3 years. "She is working for someone bigger," Marcus said slowly. "This is not just about blackmail. This is about control." "I think so," Reese confirmed. "She is building a network of compromised officials who will do whatever she wants, approve developments, block investigations, direct contracts, and everyone she has leverage over will be afraid to say no." Tony stepped forward. "There is more. This Victoria Chase. I did some digging. She grew up here in Chicago. Her father was a small businessman, ran a hardware store on the South Side. He died 20 years ago, heart attack officially. But some people say he was under pressure from certain parties who wanted his building, that the stress killed him." Marcus felt cold recognition settle into his stomach. "Which parties?" Tony hesitated. "Us. Your father made the offer. The old man refused to sell. 3 months later, he was dead. Victoria would have been in her 20s then. Old enough to remember, old enough to blame." The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture more personal and more dangerous than Marcus had imagined. This was not just about power or money. This was revenge. A woman who had lost her father was now systematically building leverage against everyone connected to the system that had destroyed him. And Marcus, as the heir to his father's organization, would be her primary target. He closed the folder and looked at the nervous investigator. "You will tell no one about this. Conversation. In exchange, I will forget that you spent 6 months documenting my life. Do we understand each other?" Reese nodded frantically. "Absolutely. I never saw you. I do not know anything." After Reese was escorted out, Marcus sat in the empty warehouse thinking. Victoria Chase had every right to hate him, every justification for wanting to destroy him. His father had been a hard man, ruthless in ways that Marcus had tried to leave behind. If her father's death could be traced to that ruthlessness, then her campaign against him was not just strategic, it was personal. And personal enemies were the most dangerous kind. But understanding her motivation did not solve his problem. She had photographs, connections, leverage. She was methodically constructing a trap that would snap shut whenever she chose. And now he knew her identity, which meant the game had entered a new phase. She would eventually learn that he knew, and then the pretense of patience would end. He needed to decide how to respond. The old way, his father's way, would be to eliminate the threat directly, permanently. But Marcus had spent 20 years trying to distance himself from those methods, trying to build something that could survive in the light. If he reverted to violence now, he would become everything his daughter feared, everything he had tried to leave behind. There had to be another way. He just had to find it before Victoria Chase decided to make her move. Marcus spent the next week learning everything he could about Victoria Chase. Her consulting firm operated from an office building in the West Loop, a glass and steel structure that reflected the cold ambition of its tenant. She employed 15 people directly and contracted with dozens more, former political staffers, data analysts, media specialists, lawyers. On paper, it was a legitimate business. the kind of operation that helped corporations navigate the complex intersection of government and commerce. But Tony's investigation revealed deeper layers. Chase had connections to organized crime figures in New York and Detroit, people who had no apparent business relationship with a political consultant. She had met with representatives of foreign investment groups whose origins were deliberately obscured, and she had been photographed at private events with politicians and business leaders from across the country, always on the periphery, always watching rather than participating. She is building an empire, Tony observed during one of their meetings. Not a criminal one exactly, something more sophisticated. She wants to control the people who control things, politicians, judges, businessmen. If she has leverage over enough of them, she does not need to break the law herself. She just needs to ask favors. Marcus understood the strategy. It was not so different from what his own family had done for generations, just executed with more finesse and less violence. But the personal dimension made it more dangerous. Victoria was not just seeking power. She was seeking justice, her own definition of it, which placed Marcus at the center of a debt that could never be repaid. He decided to approach her directly. It was a risk, revealing that he knew her identity and her purpose. But Marcus had built his reputation on meeting challenges head-on, and hiding from this one would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Better to control the terms of their engagement than wait for her to choose the moment. He sent a message through intermediaries requesting a meeting. To his surprise, she agreed almost immediately. The location she suggested was neutral, a private dining room at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place where powerful people conducted business that could not be discussed in public. He arrived 15 minutes early and was shown to the room by staff who asked no questions and would remember no names. Victoria Chase arrived precisely on time. She was taller than he had expected, with posture that suggested both confidence and control. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held an intensity that made Marcus understand why nervous men like Reese found her intimidating. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry except for a thin gold chain around her neck. She looked like what she was, someone who had turned grief into purpose, and purpose into power. Mr. DeVito. She sat across from him without offering her hand. I have been expecting your invitation for some time. You knew I would identify you eventually. I knew you would try. Whether you succeeded would depend on how well you have maintained the intelligence networks your father built. She smiled slightly, without warmth. It seems they are still functional. A server appeared with wine and appetizers, then disappeared without a word. Marcus waited until they were alone again before continuing. You blame my family for your father's death. Victoria's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. I do not blame. Blame implies uncertainty. My father refused to sell his building to your father's company. He was harassed, threatened, and subjected to pressure that destroyed his health and killed him. Those are facts, not accusations. I was not involved in those decisions. I was barely out of college when your father died, but you inherited the benefits of them. She leaned forward slightly. That building your father wanted so badly, it became part of a development that earned your family $40 million. You have been living on the proceeds of my father's death for 20 years. Marcus felt the weight of her words, the justice in her accusation. He had never known the details of that particular acquisition, had never asked how certain properties came into the family's portfolio. But ignorance was not innocence. He had profited from his father's methods, even as he tried to reform them. What do you want? He asked. Money? Some form of restitution. Victoria laughed, a sound without humor. You think this is about money? My consulting business earns more in a year than that development was worth. I do not need your money, Mr. DeVito. What I want is something you cannot give me. I want my father back. I want the last 20 years of my life back. I want justice. And since you cannot have those things, you have decided to destroy me instead. Not destroy. She picked up her wineglass and studied him over the rim. Control. There is a difference. I do not want you dead or in prison. I want you useful. I want you to understand what it feels like to be trapped by forces you cannot fight, to have your choices made for you by someone else's power. I want you to live with that helplessness every day the way my father did." Marcus met her eyes and saw something he recognized, the same cold calculation he had seen in his father, the same willingness to wait decades for revenge. She was not bluffing. She had spent years building this position, accumulating leverage, planning for this moment, and now she was savoring it. "The photograph you sent me," he said, "the one with the mayor. What do you intend to do with it?" "That depends on you." Victoria set down her glass. "I know about your arrangement with Holloway. I know about the campaign contributions, the zoning approvals, the contracts. I have enough documentation to destroy you both, but I am willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" "I have clients who need things. Political support for projects, regulatory approval for developments, favorable treatment in contract negotiations. When I need your influence with Mayor Holloway, you will provide it. When I need your other resources, your connections, your information, your access, you will make them available. In exchange, I will keep your secrets. You will continue your comfortable life, and no one will ever know the full extent of what your family has done." It was blackmail, pure and simple, but wrapped in sophistication, presented as a business arrangement rather than extortion. She was offering him a choice between two prisons, one physical, one psychological. Serve her or be destroyed by her. And if I refuse, then I release everything: the photographs, the financial records, the testimony of people who were present for conversations that should have remained private. Mayor Holloway will be forced to resign in disgrace. You will face federal prosecution. Your legitimate businesses will collapse under the scrutiny. Your daughter will learn exactly what kind of man her father really is. The mention of Sophia was calculated, Marcus knew, a reminder that her reach extended beyond him, that the consequences of his choice would touch everyone he loved. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. "I need time to consider." "Of course." Victoria remained seated, looking up at him with an expression of calm satisfaction. "Take a week. Think about your options. But understand, there is only one decision that ends well for you. I suggest you make it." Marcus left the restaurant and walked through the cold Chicago evening, past the gleaming towers of the Loop and the old brownstones of the near North Side. The city had never felt so foreign to him, so full of hidden threats and compromised relationships. Everything he had built, everything he had tried to become, was being held hostage by a woman whose grievance he could not deny. But surrender was not in his nature. Neither was the kind of violence that his father would have employed. There had to be a third option, a way to neutralize Victoria's leverage without becoming the monster she believed him to be. He just had to find it, and he had exactly 1 week to do so. This is the moment in the story where everything hangs in the balance. If this dilemma is resonating with you, I want you to leave a comment below. Write the words, "Everyone has a past, but not everyone chooses their future." Commenting helps more people discover this story, and I want to hear from those who understand that true redemption is always possible, even when it seems out of reach. The week became a marathon of research, planning, and careful investigation. Marcus pulled Tony away from all other projects and assigned him a single mission: find Victoria Chase's weakness. Everyone had one, a secret they protected, a person they loved, a mistake they had made. If he could find hers, he might be able to level the playing field. The results were illuminating. Victoria had been married once, briefly, to a man who had died in what was ruled an accidental drowning 5 years ago. She had no children. Her mother lived in a care facility in suburban Evanston, suffering from advanced dementia. Her closest relationships were professional rather than personal. She kept her employees at a distance and seemed to have no intimate friends. She lived alone in a penthouse not far from Marcus's own, surrounded by expensive furniture and what Tony's contacts described as an impressive collection of contemporary art. "She is isolated," Tony observed, "no one close enough to use as leverage. She built her life that way on purpose. Nothing to lose means nothing to threaten." But Marcus noticed something in the files that Tony had overlooked. Victoria made regular donations to a legal aid organization that specialized in helping small business owners fight predatory practices. She served on the board of a foundation that provided scholarships to children from the South Side. And her consulting firm had a pattern of taking on pro bono work for community organizations fighting displacement and gentrification. "She has not forgotten where she came from," Marcus said slowly. "She still cares about protecting people like her father. That is not a weakness we can exploit, but it might be something we can use differently. What are you thinking?" Marcus was not entirely sure yet, but an idea was forming, something that felt more like redemption than victory. If Victoria's real motivation was justice, not just revenge, but a genuine desire to protect vulnerable people from powerful interests, then perhaps there was a way to give her what she actually wanted without surrendering to her blackmail. He spent the next 2 days reviewing the history of his family's business dealings, going back to the time of his father's leadership. The records were incomplete. His father had believed in discretion above all else. But Marcus found enough to confirm the pattern. Properties acquired through intimidation, businesses destroyed to eliminate competition, people who had stood in the way of DeVito interests and suffered for it. The list was longer than he had wanted to believe. Dozens of families, hundreds of lives disrupted or destroyed by the ruthless expansion of his family's influence. Victoria's father was just one name among many. His story, one chapter in a longer chronicle of predation that Marcus had inherited without understanding its full scope. For the first time in years, he felt genuine shame, not the abstract awareness that his family's history included violence, but the specific, documented reality of that violence. These were not statistics or rumors. These were people with names and stories, people whose lives had been diminished so that the DeVito family could prosper. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not fight Victoria by finding her weakness. He would fight by acknowledging his own. The second meeting took place in the same private dining room, 1 week to the day after the first. Victoria arrived with the same composed confidence, clearly expecting either his surrender or his defiance. Instead, Marcus handed her a folder. "What is this?" "A list." Marcus sat back and watched her open it. "Every family I can identify that was harmed by my father's business practices. Every property acquired through intimidation. Every person who suffered because of the way we operated. I am not asking you to forgive me for any of it, but I thought you should know that I finally took the time to understand the full scope of what my family did." Victoria studied the documents for several minutes, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at him with eyes that held something new, not softening exactly, but a recognition that this conversation had departed from her expectations. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you were right. I inherited the benefits of crimes I did not commit, and I spent 20 years pretending that made me innocent. It does not. My father destroyed lives, and I built my comfortable existence on the rubble of those lives, including your father's." Victoria set down the folder. "This does not change anything. You still have secrets that could destroy you. I still have the leverage to expose them." "I know." Marcus leaned forward. "But I am not here to negotiate for my survival. I am here to propose something different, something that might actually serve the goal you claim to care about." "What goal is that?" "Protecting people like your father, making sure what happened to him does not happen to others. You have spent years building influence over corrupt officials, creating a network of compromised people who will do your bidding. But all that does is replace one form of predation with another. You become the thing you hate, just with better public relations." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You presume to lecture me about morality?" "No." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I am not in a position to lecture anyone, but I am in a position to offer you something more valuable than my cooperation under duress. I am offering you my cooperation by choice." "Explain." "The documentation I showed you, I want to use it. I want to establish a fund to compensate the families my father harmed. Not because you are forcing me to, but because it is the right thing to do. I want to restructure my businesses, to divest entirely from anything that operates in legal grey areas. I want to end the relationship with Mayor Holloway and whatever other compromised officials have benefited from my family's influence." Victoria listened without interrupting, her expression skeptical but attentive. In exchange, Marcus continued, "I am asking you to do something difficult. I am asking you to give up your leverage, not just over me, over everyone. Release the photographs, the documents, the compromising information you have accumulated. Let the chips fall where they may. Some of those people deserve to be exposed, others do not. But building a shadow empire of compromised officials is not justice. It is just a different kind of corruption. You are asking me to trust you. I am asking you to consider whether your current path actually leads where you want to go. You cannot bring your father back. You cannot undo what was done to him. But you can choose whether to spend the rest of your life perpetuating the same dynamics that destroyed him, or whether to break the cycle entirely." Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of grief and anger, and the slow possibility of something different. "My father believed in justice," she said finally. "Real justice, not the kind that powerful people define to suit their interests. He used to say that the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members. He was an idealist, and it killed him. It does not have to kill you too." She turned to face him. "How do I know this is not just another manipulation, another way to protect yourself by saying what I want to hear? You do not know." Marcus acknowledged the truth of her suspicion. "You have no reason to trust me, and I have given you every reason not to. But I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to watch me. I will establish the compensation fund within 30 days. I will begin the business restructuring immediately. I will document every step so you can verify that I am doing what I promised. And if I fail, if I betray the commitments I am making tonight, then you can expose everything. You will have the same leverage you have now. But if I succeed, if I actually do what I am proposing, then you will have achieved something better than revenge. You will have proven that change is possible." Victoria studied him for a long moment, her face revealing nothing. Then she picked up the folder he had given her and tucked it under her arm. 30 days, she said, "I will be watching." She left without another word, and Marcus sat alone in the private dining room, wondering if he had just made the most important decision of his life, or the most foolish one. Either way, there was no turning back now. The next month was the most difficult of Marcus's professional life. True to his word, he established the compensation fund with an initial contribution of $20 million to be distributed to families identified in his documentation. He hired a third-party administrator to manage the process, someone with no connection to his business interests who could be trusted to identify recipients and assess appropriate amounts. The fund would eventually grow to $50 million, funded by the sale of properties that had been acquired through his father's predatory methods. The business restructuring was even more challenging. Marcus had to explain to longtime associates why he was walking away from profitable relationships, closing down operations that generated millions in revenue, and severing connections that had taken decades to build. Some of them understood. Most of them thought he had lost his mind. Tony was among the skeptics. "You are dismantling everything your family built. For what? The approval of a woman who has been trying to destroy you?" "Not for her approval," Marcus replied. "For something I should have done 20 years ago. I inherited a business built on violence and fear. I convinced myself that I could reform it from within, that keeping the profitable parts while eliminating the worst abuses was enough. It was not. The only way to truly leave the past behind is to stop profiting from it entirely." The most painful conversation was with Mayor Holloway. They met in secret, as they always did, but this time Marcus came with a different message. "I am ending our arrangement," he said simply, "effective immediately." Holloway's face went pale. "You cannot be serious? We have worked together for 15 years. You have benefited enormously from our relationship, and you have benefited from mine." Marcus kept his voice calm. "But that benefit came at a cost, to both of us. We have compromised ourselves, bent the rules, rationalized choices that we knew were wrong. I am not willing to do that anymore." "What about the photograph?" Holloway's voice dropped to a whisper. If someone has evidence of our connection, then we will face the consequences. Marcus met the mayor's frightened eyes. I am not saying this will be easy. There may be investigations, questions, scrutiny, but I would rather face those things honestly than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with me. He left Holloway sitting in stunned silence and felt something he had not experienced in years, the clean sensation of having done the right thing, regardless of the cost. Victoria, true to her word, was watching. Her investigators documented the fund distributions, verified the business restructurings, confirmed the severing of political relationships. Marcus received no communication from her directly, but he knew she was tracking every step. The 30 days passed without incident. On the 31st day, she appeared at his office unannounced. His assistant showed her into his private conference room, and Marcus joined her a few minutes later, uncertain what to expect. "You did it," Victoria said. No preamble, no pleasantries. She looked different somehow. The hard edges of her expression had softened, though her eyes still held wariness. "I verified everything. The fund is real. The business changes are real. You actually kept your word. Did you think I would not? I expected you to find some loophole, some way to appear to comply while protecting your interests. That is what people in your position always do." Maybe. Marcus sat across from her. Or maybe I was telling the truth when I said I wanted to change. Not because you forced me to, but because I finally understood that I should. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the table. "What is this?" Marcus asked. "Everything. The photographs, the financial records, the testimonies, every piece of leverage I accumulated over you and the others." She met his eyes. "I am giving it to you. Do with it what you think is right." Marcus opened the envelope and flipped. Through the documents, years of work, careful investigation, patient accumulation of compromising information, all of it now in his hands. "Why?" he asked. "Because you showed me something I had forgotten." Victoria's voice carried an emotion he had not heard from her before, something that might have been hope or the beginning of healing. "My father did not just believe in justice, he believed in redemption. He thought that people could change, that they could choose to be better than their circumstances. I spent 20 years proving him wrong, building a career on the assumption that powerful people will always abuse their power. You proved that he was right. What will you do now?" "I do not know." For the first time, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Maybe find out who I am when I'm not planning revenge. Maybe use my skills for something constructive instead of destructive. I spent so long becoming a weapon that I forgot how to be a person." Marcus thought about his own journey, the years of compromise and rationalization, the slow process of awakening that had led to this moment. If I can do it, anyone can. Victoria stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I never thought I would say this, but thank you for taking my anger seriously enough to respond with something real, for not dismissing me or fighting back with the same weapons my father's enemies used, for being different." After she left, Marcus sat alone with the envelope full of secrets. He thought about the power it represented, the leverage he could use to protect himself, to advance his interests, to control the people whose compromising information it contained. Then he fed the documents into the shredder beside his desk, one page at a time, and watched 20 years of accumulated power transform into confetti. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Willis Tower, looking out at the city that had shaped him. Chicago spread beneath his feet in every direction, the glittering towers of the Loop, the sprawling neighborhoods that stretched to the horizon, the gray expanse of Lake Michigan under winter clouds. It was beautiful and brutal, this city, a place of ambition and violence and unexpected grace. So much had changed since that unmarked envelope had arrived at his door. The compensation fund had distributed its first payments, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for acknowledgement of what they had lost. Marcus's businesses, now streamlined and entirely legitimate, were thriving under leadership that did not need to hide anything from regulators or investigators. Mayor Holloway had quietly declined to run for re-election, citing family reasons, and had avoided the exposure that would have destroyed his career. And Victoria Chase had transformed her consulting firm into something different, an organization that helped community groups fight displacement, that advised small businesses on protecting themselves from predatory interests, that used all the skills she had developed for revenge in service of the protection her father had believed in. They had dinner occasionally, not as allies or enemies, but as something more complicated. Two people who had forced each other to change, and were still figuring out what that change meant. Sophia visited more often now. She had watched her father's transformation with cautious amazement, had asked questions he answered honestly for the first time, had slowly begun to rebuild the trust that his evasions had eroded over the years. Last week, she had introduced him to the philosophy professor from Columbia, a serious young man who clearly loved her and was intimidated by her father. Marcus had done his best to put the young man at ease, remembering how it felt to meet the parents of someone you loved, how much courage it took to present yourself for judgment. "Dad?" Sophia appeared beside him on the observation deck, bundled against the cold. "You have been staring at the city for 20 minutes. What are you thinking about?" Marcus smiled at his daughter. "I was thinking about how much this view has changed over the years. When I was your age, half these buildings did not exist. The skyline I grew up with is almost entirely gone. Does that make you sad?" "Not sad, exactly." He considered the question. "More aware of how temporary everything is. The buildings, the businesses, the relationships. We think we are building something permanent, but really we are just arranging things that will be rearranged after we are gone. That sounds philosophical for you." Marcus laughed. "I suppose your boyfriend is rubbing off on me." He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "But I have also been thinking about what matters, what we leave behind that actually lasts. And I have decided that it is not the buildings or the businesses or the money. It is the choices we make, the people we help or hurt, the direction we push the world, even if we do not live to see the results." Sophia leaned into him. "Is that why you made all those changes? Because you wanted to leave something different behind?" "Partly. And partly because I finally understood that I was not going to find peace any other way. I spent decades telling myself that the bad things my family did were in the past, that I was not responsible, that I could enjoy the benefits without accepting the guilt. But it does not work that way. The past lives inside us, whether we acknowledge it or not. The only way to be free of it is to face it, to make what amends we can and to choose differently going forward." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city lights flicker on as evening settled over Chicago. The wind off the lake was cold, but neither of them moved to leave. "I am proud of you, Dad." Sophia's voice was soft but clear. "I know it has not been easy. I know you gave up a lot. But the person you are becoming, that is someone I am glad to know." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes and did not bother to hide them. "That means more to me than you can possibly understand." Below them, the city continued its eternal churning. Deals being made, lives being changed, power flowing through channels visible and invisible. Marcus had been part of that flow for so long, had helped direct its currents in ways that benefited himself and harmed others. Now, he was trying something different, trying to redirect what influence he had left toward repair rather than exploitation. It was slow work, uncertain work, work that might not show results in his lifetime, but it was the right work. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt at peace with the man he was becoming. The unmarked envelope had been meant to destroy him. Instead, it had saved him, not by forcing him to submit to blackmail, but by forcing him to finally confront the truth about himself and his family. Victoria Chase had intended to make him a puppet. Instead, she had become the catalyst for his liberation. And now, standing above the city that had made him and that he was trying to help remake, Marcus DeVito allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible. Not cheap redemption, bought with money or influence. Real redemption earned through acknowledgement and action, and the daily choice to be better than before. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Winter was coming to Chicago, as it always did. But Marcus was no longer afraid of the cold. He had found warmth in unexpected places, in his daughter's forgiveness, in his own capacity for change, in the strange friendship that had grown from what was meant to be destruction. If you have watched this far, it is because you connected with this story. It means you believe in transformation, in the possibility that people can change, in the redemptive power of facing the truth about ourselves. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far, so I can get to know you," and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear that it is never too late to choose a different path. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing, along with me, that even the darkest history can be the beginning of a brighter future.